Welcome back to Between Two FARS. I'm Warnicki Miller here once again with our veteran procurement attorney, Michael Mark. He has a wealth of experience to share with us, and he's been talking to us about issues that you're going to encounter in contract administration. Specifically today, we're going to talk about some cost principles that you need to be aware of as you administer your contract. Michael, what advice do you have for our contracting officers and attorneys during contract administration?
Well, it's an area that doesn't get as much attention often as the source selection process, which I guess is viewed as more interesting. You know, once we've awarded the contract, okay, everybody goes off and does their thing. But in a cost contract, it's still important to stay on top of the administration of the contract because they're now billing costs to us. And as we pointed out, the cost principles, and there are more than 50 of them, apply to those contracts. So the contractor has to account for the cost. It has to segregate out costs that are not allowable and not bill those to us, but they still have to account for them. And then, you know, the other costs are going to be paid as long as they're reasonable, allowable, and allocable. Now, some of the costs in the cost principles are very straightforward. Lobbying costs are not allowable by law. The costs of alcohol are not allowable. But then there are other costs that are clearly allowable: personnel costs, basically the direct costs of the work and the allocable indirect costs of the work are allowed. But then you've got all kinds of elements of costs that fall into a gray area. An example might be employee health, morale, welfare, food. Well, as we pointed out, alcohol is not allowed. But I'm running a cafeteria. Is that an overhead cost that I'm allowed to charge? And the answer is yes. If I'm having a celebratory event, SpaceX launched the Dragon, it was a huge success, we're going to have everybody in, we're going to have cake, cookies, and lemonade. Is that an allowable?
I would vote yes on that one because no alcohol, right?
No alcohol, you're right. Now, if I've got beer, I can't charge the cost of the beer to that. And then we have even more arcane ones. Legal costs, for example. First of all, are they overhead? Most of the time they're G&A costs because the legal costs are spread across the benefit of all of the work. The costs of, you know, complying with SEC requirements or tax rules or, you know, environmental controls and whatnot. But some costs are not allowable. For instance, litigation. Okay, how does that work? Well, the rules are like in an employee litigation case, if it's a case involving, say, EEO matters, and the company litigates that case and wins the case, then the legal costs may be allowable. However, if the company loses the case, the costs are not allowable. And oh, by the way, the payouts are not allowable either. If it's a fine or a penalty, those are not allowable costs. So you have to understand, okay, what was the lawyer doing? That means another level of detail in the accounting of the costs. And that's an example of some of the kinds of things that you can see. Labor relations costs. Well, the costs of engaging with a union in collective bargaining, as a general rule, that's going to be allowable. But if you have an ULP practice going and you're litigating the ULP, those are probably not going to be allowable, particularly if you lose.
How will the government attorneys and contracting officers see some of these costs? Are these coming in on invoices or vouchers to be paid or progress payments? Yeah, how are we going to spot some of these costs that might not be allowable or even just be listed in a way that would cause us to question what the underlying factors of that cost may represent?
Well, that's a good question. And the answer is it depends. Obviously, a good lawyer, it always depends. You may see it as a direct charge. You know, it may be in the invoice and it says legal costs, and in which case we ought to be asking, okay, what's this all about? Because usually that's not a direct charge. But it may not show up until the contract is over. And in a cost contract, you have to audit it eventually, the incurred cost audit, to determine, okay, were the costs actually incurred? Were they less than we thought they were going to be, more than we thought they were going to be? Because in the end, either we owe them some more money on a cost contract for costs that they incurred that we had not yet paid, or vice versa, they owe us money for costs that were not incurred. And that most often occurs not in the direct cost, but it occurs in the overheads, because the overhead rates keep changing and the elements of cost in there change. So the way we're going to see that most likely is in an incurred cost audit, which may occur years after the contract is ended. And the contracting officer responsible for closeout here at the agency or at your center is the one that's first likely to see that. And you may be asked questions, so you're going to have to look at that audit. You're going to have to understand, how do these audits read? You know, DCAA has a format, and there's also a contract audit manual that DCAA has that goes into great detail about how they do this and how they analyze costs. But you've got to be able to at least understand from the cost principles point of view, okay, what's DCAA saying, and was this an allowable or unallowable cost? And the audit ought to tell you that, and it ought to identify the cost principle and maybe the cost accounting standards that apply as well. So that's most likely where you're going to see these kinds of things, not during the day-to-day administration, except, you know, if it's charged as a direct cost, and we're going to start asking questions about that. But again, you need to be able to know, to look in the FAR in part 31.2, where all of these cost principles are laid out, and it will tell you, sometimes in great detail, when it's allowable, when it's not allowable. And some of them, as I say, are clearly going to be allowable, and some are clearly not going to be allowable, but many of them it depends on the context in which that cost was incurred.
Yeah, so no falling asleep at the switch, huh? You have to sort of be aware of what's going on, look through the paperwork, ask the right questions if you don't have the details you think you need. And as we said the last time, reach out to your pricers, reach out to the more experienced contracting officers, and get a sense of when's the right time to inquire for more information.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we really appreciate you talking to us and helping to orient us to some of these cost principles. Join us again next time where we'll continue talking with Michael Mark.